He was in the middle of his 16-hour shift when suddenly, instead of breaking rocks with a pickaxe under the earth, he was standing mid-motion in a reflective golden floor. Looking around, he no longer held his pickaxe or was underground. This new place was massive, with columns made of marble and decorated with intricate drawings stretched several dozen meters into the starry sky, for there was no ceiling. Welcome, mortal. Turning his head to the center of what he assumed was a temple was the definition of beauty sitting upon a crystal throne. I freed you from a hopeless fate so that you could be the first of your kind to serve me. Beautiful long green hair, breathtaking golden eyes, a perfect physics only slightly hidden by silk, so thin it was almost transparent. It was the perfect form, fitting for one of the divine. Humanity has been found by the gods, and soon by their servant races as well. Great calamities will follow them. I am the first to reach out to you and willingly accept you as my faithful servants for the coming storm. She reaches out with a shining hand. What say you, mortal? Will you be my first follower? Her delicate yet powerful voice thundered throughout the temple. It was full of power and pride, of perfection and authority. There was but one answer a human could give when faced with such vision of the holy. No! Holy music stops. What? What did you just say? Leaving the grasp of my corporate overlords to instead be a slave of some god doesn't sound like much of a change. You dare to compare mortals to divinity? Listen, lady, you haven't even told me your name. What's your goal? What I get out of this? All you did was summon me here and demand servitude. Such insolence. The goddess flipped her wrist and made him fall face first into the ground. Then she flipped it again, and an invisible force picked him up and brought him closer to her. This isn't something you can say no to. She lifted him up by his face with her hand. The holy power that made her body tangible was burning his skin on contact. I speak. You obey. Through the pain of his face being burned and gritted teeth, he spoke. You haven't met a human yet, have you? Her perfect features now deformed into a hateful glare. Pathetic mortal, you will learn your place. In an instant, they were no longer in a temple, but in a dark cell with no light, save for the one emanating from the goddess. You shall stay and suffer here until I deem your lesson learnt. Several chains shot out from the darkness and enveloped him, hoisting him up in the air. Think about your choices and despair. She left. He was alone in complete isolation with naught but his thoughts to keep him company. And so he stayed for an unknown amount of time. He knew at least days had passed, for his stomach was grumbling constantly. He had time to consider his actions and construct the perfect phrase he wanted to convey to the goddess if she came back. After what felt like weeks, she did return. The telltale sigh that she was there was always through the blinding light she used to announce her presence. Have you thought about your transgressions, mortal? He looked up at her. I have. She birthed a wide smile. And what say you now? Fuck off. Her smile disappeared instantly and was replaced by a wrinkled, hateful face. Yudare. He felt his arms and legs twist and break, his flesh being peeled from bone, his brain being turned to mush. Then he woke up and was fine. Death is too much of a kindness for you. She turned her back on him. You shall suffer eternally without the possibility of death. I won't allow it. Then she vanished. For the next millennia, he was suspended in that cell, being broken in body and mind, but never in spirit. Every few decades, the goddess would visit, screaming at him for not bending the knee and torturing him in several ways until she left him in isolation again. Time was almost meaningless inside that cell. All he felt was loneliness until the visits. Then he would feel pain. She would get bored and leave, then he would be lonely again. However, there was something he noticed. Little by little, the time between visits would increase. Slowly, she stopped torturing him and started to compare his stubbornness to something she saw outside. Your stubbornness is worse than the Krills. Those prideful bastards think just because they have the mightiest god of war on their side, they get to be arrogant even when facing other divine beings. She went on for hours about situations involving them and their deeds until something reminded her she had work to do. That was the cataclysm for he to become something of a confidant. It was slow at first. She would make her flashy entrance, ask if he regretted his sins. He would tell her to fuck off in increasing creative ways and she would torture him for it. Then she would belittle him in such a way that would segment into a monologue of her woes of a divine life in dealing with other races and gods, and he, barely sane, would listen. It's ridiculous, really. Why would they convince their chosen race to abandon their physical bodies in search for enlightenment? Such things should be left for their betters. That went on for centuries. Eventually, she stopped demanding anything from him and only used him as someone to speak her mind. It was the funniest thing I ever saw. A mortal outsmarting a god and robbing them of their powers. For his part, he remained silent. Countless years in that cell made him forget everything outside of it. He could no longer remember his name, where he came from, who his parents were, what he was before being locked up. Only one thing remained clear in his fractured mind. Won't surrender to her, no matter what. Something of 1,000 years later, the goddess came into his cell with a much less theatrical entrance than before. She paced around him for a few moments until she stopped in front of him and chose to speak. Isn't this enough? It's been millennia. Say that you want to be free, and I shall make it so. Freedom. The alien word felt sweet on his dried and cut lips. He'd been walking this desert for so long he'd forgotten that water existed, and now that the memory of such a time returned, he thirsted for it. But something came screaming from the back of his mind. Something primal and full of spite. Looking back at her, he felt vitality return to his ruined body. I will not beg or ask freedom from you. Either cut the chains or be gone from my sight. She stared at him for a full minute. Even after all this time, you still haven't learned humility. I'm disappointed, mortal. Away with you! As if he'd blinked, the goddess wasn't there anymore. And so it remained for the next several thousand years. Occasionally, she would return to his cell, but gone was the banter. The punishment, the insults, now all she did was stare expectantly at him. She'd wait for hours to see if he'd ever give in and accept his freedom on her terms. It never happened. She waited anyway. Sometimes for a full week she would wait for his response until her holy tasks called her away. Until one visit. As usual, the goddess had arrived and waited for him. A single hour passed until she moved from her usual spot and approached the suspended human. With a very delicate hand, she touched his face, followed by the other. Stop this madness, mortal. Say the words and this hell will be over. His spiteful eyes met hers. The feeling of her touch on his skin was otherworldly. After feeling only pain and misery for too long, the sensation of not only a comforting hand upon his face, but one of divine nature brought him to tears. Enough. I don't want to suffer anymore. He opened his mouth to say the words he desperately wanted to say. No. The goddess recoiled from him. Her face a whirlwind of emotions, raging from shocked to confusion to anger and regret. She vanished shortly after. Several millennia passed. The goddess only visited Tree more times after that day, with 1,000 years between them. The visits would last moments until she went away again, almost as if it was a mistake to come there. In those visits, it was plain to see she winced every time she looked at him, always diverting her gaze to somewhere else that wasn't his ruined figure. In the third visit she appeared, looked at him, covered her mouth in disgust and shame, and vanished. After that, she visited no longer. And he remained alone. How long had passed? What was of the world outside the cell? When the goddess stopped gossiping at him, the news from the outside had ceased. What was of? What did we call ourselves again? It started with a E? Yes. Yes, it did start with a H. But what about the rest? What did she call him? He was certain she called him by the name of his people. But he forgot. Wait, what's my name? I don't remember. What was my name? He felt his cheeks wet. Something inside of him wept at something crucial being forgotten. It wept at another part of him being lost to this torture. And that sadness bubbled its way to the surface, making him release a few tears. But in large part, he himself didn't understand why the tears were flowing from his almost skeleton face. More time passed. The husk of a being that once resembled a man felt a new sensation since his incarnation. Cold. He was cold. Why was he cold? He'd never felt it before. Realization hit him. This was it. The end. The release of his eternal torment was finally here. Countless millennia of misery finally came to an end. Soon he would be free. So why did he feel so helpless? So angry? Why did he feel such despair? His soul was screaming at him that he was the victim of a horrible unfairness, and now that oblivion awaited him, it was raging against this ending. "I'm so sorry." The cold vanished, and in its place came warmth. The chains binding him were no more. His form was no longer hoisted up in the air, but in the embrace of the goddess. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry it took me this long to make things right. Oh, Creator, please forgive me." Her tears flowed freely from her grief-stricken eyes and landed on his face. The healing powers of holy tears kicked in and restored much of his ruined features. With his vision restored, he looked up at her. She looked different. Still, the undeniable vision of beauty, but older than before. Traces of time's grasp were visible in her features. Her aura of blinding light wasn't there. The confidence and arrogance that sculpted her very being had vanished. She looked almost mortal. The being that held him was undoubtedly the goddess, yet so much was different from the first time he saw her. "My power can no longer maintain your soul together. Only after I felt you starting to slip away did I swallow my pride and face my shame." Her tears continued to flow uninterrupted. "This madness was my soul doing from a time I arrogantly thought myself above mortals. Having been rejected for the first time, I lashed out and committed unspeakable evil acts against you." Her voice broke down a few times from her sobs. "I can't make amends to you. Your time is at an end, but I swear on my immortal soul that I'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again. I will deliver myself to your people and face judgment for my sins." She took a moment to compose herself. "You missed so much. Humans have become the only race to challenge the rule of the gods and succeed. Through them, me and countless others have learned a lot about the true meaning of conviction. Mercy, compassion, wrath, and so much more." She caressed his scared face. "You have also taught me much, the true meaning of persistence and defiance." She put a hand on his face. "So please, if there's something, anything you wish me to do, speak it now and I'll stop at nothing to make it so." There was only one thing that came to his splintered mind, and with a raspy and barely audible voice he spoke. "What's my name?" The goddess stopped herself from weeping. "Your name is Jefferson, and I will make sure it will never be forgotten." His mind was fading, but he still wished something from her, so with a Herculean effort he smiled at her. "How about a kiss before I go?" She smiled brightly at him. "Of course." The goddess carefully pulled him up and brought her lips to meet his. Through the power of a true, compassionate, divine kiss, Jefferson felt his heart warm and his mind quieting. After an eternity in hell, his soul was at peace. Jefferson crumbled to dust in the arms of the goddess. She remained in the cell for years, trying and failing to quiet her uncontrollable sobbing. Eventually, she succeeded. "Mother, are you all right?" The goddess rose from the ground. "Yes, I am now. Sorry for keeping you away all this time." The daughter approached and embraced her mother. "Are you sure you want to go ahead with this? You know how unforgiving they can be." She caressed her daughter's hair. "Justice must be served. Whatever punishment they impose on me, I shall accept. That's why you must now take my place. Become not a being moved only by arrogance and pride like I was." The goddess released her daughter from the embrace and looked directly at her beautiful green eyes. "Become a goddess of mercy." With that, the goddess left to face the consequences of her actions. When Jefferson's story was made knowledge to humanity, he was made a martyr and a symbol, hailed as one of the greatest humans to ever live.